Ready when you are.
Okay. Well, welcome Steve Zautke.
Yes.
I knew I was going to have trouble with that name. To Oscar Grady Public Library. You're here to speak about, you've been in racing and being a motorsports historian since the 1980s, and have worked extensively at MotoAmerica and Milwaukee Mile, and have authored numerous books about racing, particularly racing here in Wisconsin. And you're the current host of the Traction Reaction podcast on YouTube. And I thought it was really super interesting. This is a very interesting fact about you, that you're on the National Sprint Car Hall of Fame induction committee.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really cool.
Thank you.
Interesting fact. So welcome to the library.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So
Hopefully it won't. This should only be about 5-6 hours.
if I know racing fans, that's what they come for.
My name's Steve, as she said, and I just wanted to introduce a little bit about me. Traction Media, I cover a lot of races in the Midwest, at the Milwaukee Mile, MotoAmerica, Indianapolis, and I originally was on the radio in Milwaukee for 15 years. I did that for 15 years, originally through the Milwaukee Mile. I was hired at the Milwaukee Mile as a historian, and also worked with Jim Tradle in promotions. And one of my duties was to be on the radio for the mile and kind of promote the track and whatnot. And I did that for many years. And we would do the Milwaukee Mile. Great Lakes Ragway was a sponsor, so we would be out there. And I've been able to do a lot of neat things. One of them was work up PA at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, something that I never thought I would be able to do. That was a really cool day to do that. And that's a really bad photo, but not many photos. Before iPhones, this is me at Hales Corner Speedway when I worked track safety. So actually my first job in a race was track safety as an EMT paramedic. We worked at Hales Corner Speedway and Sun Prairie I did all the open wheel events. Did the midget races, World of Outlaws, USAC races. Did that for a few years. I got in through racing with my father. That's my father on the right. That's band leader Skitch Henderson, who was before Doc Severinsen on The Tonight Show. That's at State Fair Park in 1967. He shot at the Milwaukee Mile from roughly about 1960 through the mid-70s. And he loved getting close to the action. That's, I believe, Dick Rathman hitting the wall. And that's my father. It's not a great group photo, but on the left there, avoiding him. And that's my father, Jerry Kowicki. It's from 1971. We were friends with the Kowickis. We were from West Dallas, and we grew up on the west side of State Fair Park, and the Kowickis were on the just right off of 76 in Greenfield. My first job at the Milwaukee Mile was as a videographer in 1993. And I also had started with my friend John Wiedemann, started RacingNation.com, and we were able to do some cross-promotion with some race teams and do some sponsorship stuff for some of the NASCAR teams. Also did with Russ Lake, a family friend of ours, we did the Wisconsin Motorsports Charities. I was on the board for that, and we did that for about 10 years and raised usually about $30,000 a year for ranch charities. It's the old Farmer Vic in the ranch. That was their charity that we did. Yeah, been able to meet a lot of people, and it's offered me a lot of opportunities, such as visiting Jay Leno out in California. We're going to talk about Wisconsin race in general. One of them, of course, is the Milwaukee Mile, which is the oldest continuously operating racetrack in the world. And it starts all the way back to the teens. That's actually about 1909. That's the Blitz and Benz with Barney Oldfield driving it. That's one of the most famous race cars around. And racing was a spectacle back then. The automobile was in its infancy, so to see cars run at speed. People have never seen cars go 60 miles an hour before. Cars would be putting along, the road streets at like 15, 20 miles an hour. So to see one go past at 60 plus miles an hour is an absolute spectacle. And Milwaukee Mile saluted a lot of champions. That's Kawicki. This one somehow got in out of order. But one of the things I also did was do the programs at the Milwaukee Mile with Jim Petrato. And that's one of them that we did on Alan Kawicki. Short races were the norm back in the teens. Automobiles were, like I said, in their infancy, so they would break down a lot. So a lot of the races were just sometimes they go. Barney Oldfield was famous for breaking track records of a mile. So he'd try and break the mile a minute track record. So usually it'd be 1 lap, but you'd also have 5 and 10 lap races. And Milwaukee Mile has had about 4 grandstands. And this is from about 1911. You can see the different grandstand there and the lattice on the starter stand. It was still dirt back then. That one was burned down. They lost that one in a fire. One was also damaged by a tornado. West Dallas had a tornado in the late teens that did a lot of damage. And Milwaukee Automobile Club was huge in Milwaukee as a promotion of automobiles. I got this from the Carol Jensen collection. It's a chauffeur's certificate. That previous photo of Barney Oldfield and the Bliss and Benz, the director of the Milwaukee Automobile Club, he was the one that was promoting. So not only did they promote automobiles, but auto racing was a great way to promote the automobile back then. And of course, why should you belong? And it was just a way to, they would do tours and whatnot. It was a way for put people in automobiles. And at that time, automobiles were huge for manufacturing, not only in Detroit, but also Indianapolis. Did a lot of manufacturing. There's also manufacturing in Milwaukee too. And just some of the neat things that they did was they would have automobile shows and whatnot, so all the major manufacturers would show up. In 1912, they had the Vanderbilt Cup here. And a lot of people think it was held at the Milwaukee Mile. It was actually held on the north side of Milwaukee. And it was roughly off of Burleigh from 35th Street up to 60th Street on city streets. And why it was done there, because that 35th Street was as far as the trains came. Mm-hmm. So when they built the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, where it is currently located, that's as far as the trains went. So it's it was access. You had to get the fans to it. Ralph De Palma was a great early racer, and he was in this race in 1912 at the Vanderbilt Cup and got hurt. He got pitched from his car, and the race was held in late October, and there were still farm fields on the west side. So from 60th West was all farm fields yet in Milwaukee. He got pitched from his car, and he landed on a corn stalk. And the corn stalk went in, and he was actually stuck in the corn stalk. They had to pull him off. And he spent about 4 months at the Old County General Hospital. And whenever he was in Milwaukee, he would visit the nurses and doctors and visit the patients on behalf of the hospital because they were able to get him back, and he was able to race again. $1, but they had box seats there. There was, I think, 4 races that were held that weekend, and it was, like I said, it was September, actually, the end of September it was. And it was a huge event, and it makes sense because at that time Milwaukee was I think the 8th largest city in the U.S. That's David Bruce Brown. He was a Fiat driver. He was from the East Coast, came from a very rich family, and he wanted to be a race car driver. And his family knew the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, was a connected person. Of course, his family was against it, but unfortunately, he was killed in this event during practice. Mm-hmm. And that's the cover of the program. And that's a Peter Hout painting of Barney Oldfield, who replaced David Bruce Brown in the Fiat for that race. And that's a photo from the Milwaukee Mile in 1917. That's a match race they had between Barney Oldfield and Ralph De Palma, who came back in a Packard. And the funny car there, that's the Golden Submarine that was built by Harry Miller, who would dominate racing in the 20s and 30s with his designs of engines and cars. And that's a photo of the J.I. Case team. J.I. Case, of course, out of Racine. They were huge in auto racing just at the turn of the century into the teens and that. And they used auto racing to do a lot of promotion of their equipment. And that's the Milwaukee Mile. We saw that one before. MotoAmerica. MotoAmerica, of course, this one's out of sequence. That's the front straightaway of a Formula 5000 race in 1969. We'll be talking more about that in a moment. The Milwaukee Mile in 1939, football was held there. So people always wonder, how did Green Bay survive? Well, Green Bay survived with the help of Milwaukee. For a brief time, I think for 3 seasons, Milwaukee had an NFL team. But at that time in the 30s, 20s and 30s, there would be multiple teams that would come into the league and out. You had small teams that were scattered all about, especially up in the north. And one of them was the Milwaukee Badgers. That team, I believe, only lasted 3 years. However, Green Bay, they would hold four games in Milwaukee. And initially they held them at Wisconsin State Fair Park. And that's where the championship game was held, in which they won 27-0. And if you're wondering where it was held, where the track was, let's see, it's not going to show up on there, is it? So you can see the track. So this was, if you remember the grandstands that was just torn down in 2003. This was built during the WPA, and they're just starting to build it right here. So the grandstands are done. They're just putting on the first roof here, and the track is still here. The footprint is still the same, and this is a quarter-mile track they had here. And then so the football field was held would be on the south end of the paddock, and then they had huge bleachers here. So primarily they could seat a decent amount of people there. And with, of course, being in West Dallas and that, it was close enough to downtown Milwaukee and that. And that's how the Packers were able to survive. And there's a photo you can see there of the familiar grandstands. One of the things I want to talk about is you can always talk about racing and tracks and whatnot, but it's the stories and the people. This is Doc McKenzie. Unfortunately, Doc McKenzie got killed at the Milwaukee Mile in 1935, and he's one of these stories that you hear about. Sadly, Doc was known because he had a Van Dyke, which was rare back then. A lot of people did not. Facial hair was kind of, we see people in the 1890s and that, Grover Cleveland, Rutherford B. Hayes, and all these presidents had facial hair, and that kind of went away. But there are still guys in the 30s that you would see guys and whatnot. And Doc McKenzie was one of them. He got married, he shaved his beard off, and then he got killed. So everybody was like, oh no, you can't shave before a race now.
Oh.
And there it is, shave Lucky beard when married. That's one of my favorite photos. That's at the State Fair. That's Wilbur Shaw, and that's actually that race was held on a Monday. So it's kind of a funny story. It got rained out the night before, or the day before on the Sunday, and they really didn't want to travel down to all the way back to Indianapolis and then come back the following week. So they talked to the promoter. This is before the Marchese's. We'll talk to them. We'll talk about them later. They didn't want to do that, so they talked to the promoter in the stand. We'll do it Monday afternoon. So about 2:30, 3 o'clock, they held a practice session. At that time, because they knew the factory workers would be coming out, like Alice Chalmers and all the manufacturing around there, they'd hear the race cars and they'd go, hey, let's go to the races. So they were able to recoup some of the money. And the winner of the race was Wilbur Shaw. And you may ask, did they have license? Did you need a license to race a race car? Back then you did. And that's a AAA license for Steve Trushin out of Gary. And Rex Mays, some of you may remember a Rex Mays Classic. Why is there a Rex Mays Classic? Rex Mays was a very, very famous race car driver in the 30s and 40s, and never won Indianapolis, but won the pole 3 times in a row, was a top front runner and won everywhere else. And in 1948, Duke Dismore crashed him, hit the wall, he got thrown out, and was laying in the middle of the track. And Rex, you see, so that's Duke's car on the left, and that's Ted Horn just missing Dismore, who's laying in the middle of the track, and that's Rex May's car up against the wall, who deliberately crashed his car and was signaling drivers that there was a driver on the track. And that's the Marchese brothers. The Marcheses were an Italian family, recent immigrants, I think first generation immigrants, and they had a fruit stand. They were businessmen, and that's one thing about Ralph De Palma too. Ralph De Palma was always dressed very well, as were the Marcheses here, and because there was a lot of discrimination against the Italian Americans back then. And they wanted to present themselves not as thugs or mafia people, but as businessmen. And the Marcheses were certainly in that vein, as well as Ralph De Palma. Ralph De Palma off the track, always dressed in a suit and a tie, because he wanted to present that look to people. And he was looked on and very well respected, even after he retired. The Marcheses, and that's Tom, second from the left. Carl was a former driver on the left. He would eventually run the track, so to speak. Tom was the businessman, that's the older brother. Joseph on next to Tom, and then on the end, that's Tootie Marchese. And unfortunately, there's a lot of tomfoolery with promoters back then. It wasn't uncommon for a promoter to come into town, put up the bills, come to the racetrack, gather all the money, have the drivers go do the race, and while they were on the track, he'd skip town with the money. Mm-hmm. So Marcheses ran a very professional organization. They were known in the business world, and they promoted a race. Tom was a racer and finished 4th at Indianapolis, and later that year he got hurt. He had a very good career coming, and they owned race cars and whatnot. And they wanted to try some promotion at the Milwaukee Mile. And they thought it was very, very well produced. They knew business, they were business people, they knew how to run a business. And the fair board said, we really like what you guys are doing. We'd like you to have exclusive rights. So that's where the exclusive rights at State Fair started in the late 30s. And they were the exclusive promoter all the way through 1967. And they formed what was called Wisconsin Auto Racing. And later, John Cation became a part of that organization. Midget car racing was huge after World War II. It was one of these things where it was the right time, right place at the right time. The little cars started before the war. They were popular, they were cheap, and they were fun to watch. And they did a lot of barnstorming and whatnot. And one of the most famous drivers was Sam Hanks, who eventually went to Indianapolis. And after war, out in California, they could race 6 days a week, with the exception of Mondays. So they could race on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, even Sundays. And Sam was kind of a businessman too. He would wear a sport coat. He'd come to the bank on Mondays, and he was a top runner. He could win a lot of races back then, and they paid you cash. So when he went to the bank on Mondays, he would have money stuffed in all his pockets. And he'd come to the teller, he'd be dumping money, and the teller would be like, "What the heck do you do?" And he would have to explain to him that he was a race car driver. But the Milwaukee Mile then at that time became probably next to Indianapolis one of the most famous tracks. And one of the biggest things that occurred was in 1953 when they decided to pave it. It was a horse track dating back to the 1890s, and their decision to pave the track in 53 and it was completed in 54 really separated, because at that time there were only not even a half dozen paved racetracks in the United States. So you had Indianapolis, of course, Darlington came, there's a track in Raleigh, North Carolina that did not last long, a small track up in the Northeast called in Thompson, Connecticut, and then the Milwaukee Mile. In 1963 was a big conversion to rear-engine cars with Formula One type cars, and one of the teams that came over was Lotus, and they formed a partnership with the Ford Motor Company and with Jimmy Clark and Dan Gurney, and those guys came to they almost won Indianapolis in May of '63, and they ran Trenton later that year and the Milwaukee Mile. And they eventually, the 1963 Tony Bettenhausen 200 is a very significant race in IndyCar racing, because it was the first time a rear engine car won. And it would set up a revolution where basically, like it is today, Indy cars are rear engine cars. Stock car racing started to become big. So as midget car racing was really huge, and for about 5 years was really big. But stock car racing right around the late 40s or so started to come around too. And that became a spectacle not only in the South, but also in the North. And so much so that Marchese and Sam Nunes, another promoter in the North, approached AAA and said, "Hey, we need to do something. This is a real popular racing, and there's this new organization down south called NASCAR." And NASCAR wanted to race at the Milwaukee Mile. And so, kind of as a blocking move, the American Automobile Association, AAA, which is the same people that do the towing today, the Auto Club, they were sanctioning auto racing. They had sanctioned auto racing since the mid 1900s. And so they decided with reluctance to sanction national stock car racing. And the Milwaukee Mile became the hub of stock car racing in the North, running 4 times. It wasn't unusual to see cars of all types, like a 64 there, and also the Edsel. And so it was a way for people to cheer on, whether if you were a Chevy family, a Ford family, or a Chrysler family, you could cheer on the car that you like or the driver. In 1968, this was a huge, one of these things at the time, we didn't know how big it would be, but Miller, of course, Miller was based in Milwaukee and had supported auto racing for many years. And they did not want to sponsor a race car. So they came up with an idea to sponsor a race, which was very unusual at that time. So they ended up sponsoring the biggest stock car race that they had, which was in July. It was a 200-miler, became known as the Miller 200. And it's considered the first corporate race sponsorship. And with the money that brought into that extra money, it became a very lucrative race. It was probably one of the top 5 stock car races in America when it came to total purse. And that's a photo of course, Dick Trickle and Alan Kowicki. That's a stage photo that was taken about 1984. And of course, two Wisconsin guys with a huge fan following, and really helped promote stock car racing in the Midwest. About right after the war, road racing became a huge thing at Watkins Glen out in California too, places like Pebble Beach, and also Elkhart Lake. And how this came about was Elkhart Lake was a huge vacation community before World War II. And for whatever reason, after the war, people stopped going up to Elkhart Lake. And the Chamber of Commerce had a meeting, and they're saying, like, what are we going to do? And they came up with an idea about having a road race on the streets around Elkhart Lake. In 1950 was the first one. And the first year, they probably had close to 50,000 people. Now, of course, all those 50,000 people did not pay, but they did bring in a lot of people, and it also gave publicity to the village of Elkhart Lake. The following year, they almost doubled that, and then in 1953, they had probably close to 150,000, so it was a huge, huge success. And they literally raced through the streets of Elkhart Lake and then out onto the county roads around Elkhart Lake. The person behind that was Cliff Tufte and his wife, and they were community leaders, and they were involved at the Chamber of Commerce. And Cliff Tufte was the person who said road racing. There's a misnomer that road racing was banned. There was a bad accident up in Watkins Glen, New York, and a couple other in California, in which some spectators were killed. It was not banned, but basically it was regulated out of existence by the insurance regulators. You couldn't get insurance for the races anymore. So they decided, well, we need to build tracks. So Watkins Glen built a racetrack, and as did Elkhart Lake, Wisconsin, which became MotoAmerica. And Cliff Tufte was really the person behind it. And so MotoAmerica became one of the premier racetracks right away when it was built, and the first race was held in 1955. In 1956, NASCAR came to MotoAmerica. And it's interesting that NASCAR had been trying to get into the Milwaukee Mile for many years. In fact, there's photos of Bill France. Bill France is a huge fellow, 6'5", and he's leaning up against the scorer's stand talking to Tom Marchese, who had his fedora on and his suit. And, Bill is begging him for a race, which Tom Marchese would love to have done. But unfortunately, AAA was very, very protective of its tracks. It would not allow a NASCAR race at a AAA track. So the next best thing was to run up the MotoAmerica. And so they did, and Tim Flock, that was a photo, the previous photo was Tim Flock, who ended up winning the race. And it was considered a successful race, but they only came up there once in 1956, and eventually we'll see if they ever return. Of course, Ferrari, the beautiful, beautiful cars raced at Elkhart Lake. And this is one that was owned, I think, a Ferrari 430, if I recall. This car was owned by Jim Kimberly. And like I said, I wanted to talk about personalities. Jim Kimberly is one of those. You heard of the Kimberly-Clark Corporation. Well, Jim Kimberly was a part of that organization, a person of well-means, needless to say. And that's Phil Hill there with the winner's trophy from the first race. And Jim Kimberly was a tall man with beautiful silver hair and was quite the ladies' man, to say this. And that's his van, and he has strategically placed 3 women to make sure that they would watch the race, cheering for his cars. So MotoAmerica became one of the premier racetracks, and it's an interesting side story in this between MotoAmerica and then the Milwaukee Mile, and then later Great Lakes Dragway. Great Lakes Dragway was built in the 50s, and so you had these 3 national tracks. But what was nice about it is in the winter they would always have dinner. Cliff Tufte, the Marcheses, and Broadway Bob Metzler owned Great Lakes Dragway, and they always made sure that they never stepped on each other's events. There was a gentleman's agreement that, okay, let's see, what windows do we have? And if you look, they always did. So you had for many years, the schedule was always pretty much the same, in which you had, the Milwaukee Mile had 6 races. You had a good 4 or 5 races up at Road America, and they all kind of fit in almost like a zipper, chains in a zipper. And then the 2 big events at Great Lakes Dragway was on Memorial Day and Labor Day. And so Elkhart Lake, very many huge races with race cars. That's the Carroll Shelby Cobra team, and then you had the Briggs Cunningham team behind there, and just a who's who of drivers would race at Road America. And that's the famous pagoda, which is one of those things, you always hear stories of things are always better. Cars were faster, drivers were faster, and the pagoda has gone through this. Everybody misses the pagoda. It's a really cool thing. But as my friend Tom Schultz, the historian at Road America, used to say, yeah, it was fun for a while, but at the end it stunk. It was covered in mildew. Wood was rotting out of it. It had served its purpose. One of the neat things about the Road America track, as well as the Milwaukee Mile, is that footprint of the track is exactly the same. And there's not too many tracks that can do that. Road America is 4 miles around, and you could take any of the drivers from 1955 in that first race, and you could put them on that track today, and they would be shocked. With the exception of runoff areas and whatnot and safety improvements, the actual footprint of the track is exactly the same as it was in 1955. That's David Hobbs, who came over here. It's a formula, what they call Formula 5000, and that was a really neat series. It was basically Formula 1 chassis with a V8 5-liter engine in it. It was a cost-effective series, hence the name 5000. It was very popular. It started in England in the mid-'60s and then came over here a few years later. And David Hobbs was the champion in the Formula 5000 class in 1969. There's Cliff Tufty again with race driver Dan Gurney. Dan Gurney, of course, is a huge name in auto racing. And this year, up at Road America, we'll be having, for the second time, a Dan Gurney reunion with many of his cars, over 50 of his cars this year in July at the Vintage event up at Road America. This is a neat story. So this is a Maserati, birdcage Maserati, Tipo 61. Mm-hmm. And that's Jim Jeffords driving it. And racing is there's a lot of neat stories. And Jim Jeffords was a very good driver, later became a businessman very well. But the story with this car is neat because he bought the car and he wrote a check that didn't have money in the bank account. And so he took delivery of the car and he ended up winning the race, and with that money was able to cover the check. That's Bruce McLaren. So you hear about McLaren Formula 1 today and the McLaren road cars. There actually was a McLaren. Bruce McLaren was from New Zealand, and it was a familiar face up at Road America in the Can-Am series. And that's his car with Denny Holm was his teammate. And they dominated what was then called the Can-Am series. The Can-Am series was a neat series because it basically had no rules. Basically 4 wheels, and that was pretty much it. You had to have certain safety things and a wheelbase and that, but beyond that, you could do whatever you wanted. And that's a later model McLaren with Lothar Maschenbacher driving it, and that's a front straightaway at Road America. And there's the Pagoda again, and that's a Can-Am race again with a McLaren and a Lowland in the front row. Many drivers raced at Road America, even the great Jackie Stewart, who drove Can-Am in Formula One. For a Formula One racer, it's not unusual for a top-line Formula One racer today to make about $40 million. Michael Schumacher, for many, many years when he drove for Ferrari, that was one of the highest, if not number one, top three grossing athletes in the world. But back then, Formula One was very prestigious, but did not pay as well. So actually, the Can-Am series over here in the United States ran on more or less the second half of the season, second half of the summer, I should say. And it was sponsored by Reynolds Aluminum, and they had really good purses. So a driver like Jackie Stewart could actually run in the Can-Am series and make more money, especially if you were able to win and make more money in the Can-Am series than you could drive in Formula One. There's David Hobbs and Derek Bell after their win in the '79 Pabst 500. Of course, the Pabst family is known, of course, for their brewery now. But Augie Pabst is a great supporter of racing and a great driver himself. Bruce Jenner, yes, Bruce Jenner was a race car driver at MotoAmerica, driving in the Trans Am series. And Paul Newman is an interesting story here. That's Paul Newman in a Nissan 300Z. Paul Newman got into auto racing when he started a movie in 1960. It was filmed in '68, released in '69, called Winning, and fell in love with the sport. Paul liked it because he wasn't a great athlete. He wasn't a great basketball player, wasn't a good football player or whatever. But he noticed when you could drive a race car, it felt comfortable to him. And so he was able to kind of even things out. He found out that he was a pretty good driver, and he could, everybody was telling him, hey, you should really kind of pursue this. So he was able to pursue a second career as a race car driver and didn't start doing it until he was in his mid-40s. And there's Augie Pabst, I just mentioned before, just to the left of Paul Newman. And one of the things that he liked was he found out that generally, when he was at the racetrack, people left him alone and just treated him as another driver, and he really enjoyed that. And here's Paul walking next to a transporter. And that's then in the 80s, he became friends and acquainted with Carl Haas, who was an importer of race cars. And he said, Carl approached him and said, hey, would you be interested in forming an IndyCar team? He said, only if we could get Mario Andretti. He said, well, I got Mario Andretti. So they started a very successful race team that was around for 30-some years. Once again, getting to the stories. So the first IndyCar race was held in 1982 at MotoAmerica. And, you would have drivers that would come into the series. If they couldn't get a ride in Formula One, they would come over to IndyCar, and they would be pretty successful. One of the drivers was Hector Rabake. He was a Mexican driver that had some decent money from Carta Blanca, which was a brewery. And he drove for a new team of Forsyth Racing. And he was getting the hang of it, getting the hang of racing in the States and racing with the tracks and whatnot. He raced at MotoAmerica I think this was late August of '82, I think. And he ended up, he was running well, and the first four drivers ran out of fuel. He ended up winning. He only led one lap. It was the final lap. It was the only lap he ever led. And he lost his sponsorship after the race, even though he had won the race, and never raced another IndyCar race again. And getting back to running, the photo of the Edsel, one of the things is if you went up to the June Sprints or some of the other races up at MotoAmerica, you never knew what you would find on the track. And that's a Renault Alliance that's running on the track. Oh, there's the Edsel again. NASCAR came to MotoAmerica in the 2000s, and it was very, very successful. It's kind of a head scratcher why they didn't come before. One of the things is they were racing at the Milwaukee Mile, and There were some issues with the money and the promotion and how they were running the track back in the late 2000s. And so when they lost their chance to run at the Milwaukee Mile, they went up to MotoAmerica and became a very, very successful race. And so it wasn't unusual for 60,000 plus to be at a NASCAR race. Tony Bettenhausen was one of those families that were a very, very popular driver from nearby Tinley Park, Illinois. It was known as Tinley Park Express. He raced midgets up at the Milwaukee Mile just before World War II, and then after World War II, raced midgets, sprint cars, everything, including IndyCars and yes, stock cars. Other famous race cars that raced at the Milwaukee Mile, such as the fabulous Hudson Hornet, which became famous in the movie Cars. That was based on that car, and Marshall Teague was the driver. And there was the Hudson Hornet was a very, very popular car. They actually talk about it in the movie Cars because of its the layout. Car bodies and that were up in the 50s were put on top. That's why they had a taller stance. The Hudson actually came down and it had a lower center of gravity, making it one of the best handling stock cars. Of course, there are famous drivers that raced not only at the Milwaukee Mile, but also MotoAmerica was Parnelli Jones. And Parnelli Jones would win 7 straight races at the Milwaukee Mile, becoming a fan favorite between 1963 and 65. Other drivers that were famous is Don White, of course, with his yellow Dodge Chargers for many years, raced at the Milwaukee Mile from Keokuk, Iowa, which many drivers came from the small town that's right on the Mississippi River from Keokuk, Iowa. Norm Nelson was from Racine, Wisconsin, and you see Jerry Kowicki behind him. He was his chief mechanic, the father of Alan Kowicki, and became a very, very popular driver at the Milwaukee Mile, and a winning driver too. And that's his car with his teammate Roger McCluskey, who won several stock car championships. That's from 1969. Of course, A.J. Foyt was a driver, a very famous driver, a winning driver at the Milwaukee Mile too. And one of his most famous races was one he didn't win. So in 1965, when the rear engine cars had pretty much taken over IndyCar racing, his car did not show up. And the previous day, they were in Springfield, Illinois at a dirt track race. And at that time, dirt tracks were on the schedule for IndyCars, and they had towed the car up from Springfield to Milwaukee. So all he had available was the dirt track car, and he ended up trying to just put the car in the show, and he ended up taking the pole. And so much so that he thought the gentleman that was taking the times, he called him a dumb son of a bitch. You don't even know how to run a stopwatch. And sure enough, when he went out for practice or went out to qualify, he was on the pole. So of course, AJ did not apologize for that one. Because the cars, unfortunately, the cars were only, it was a 200-mile race, and they were only able to, they had enough fuel for 100 miles, so he had to take a long pit stop. Those cars ain't really set up for pit stops, so he ended up losing some time in the race. During the race, ended up finishing second, but he considers that probably one of his best races in his career. And there he is against Mario Andretti. That's the creek. Yeah, so that's why I threw that in there. A lot of people may want that's the Honey Creek River that used to run from turn 4, would circle around to the backstretch, and then exit under turn 1. And that is still there to this day. It's just that it was covered up when they redid Pit Road in that 1967. Famous race cars, of course, and that is, of course, the famous Mercuries in the late 50s. It was very popular. There's the Sam Hanks car. Several times, people may not be aware is that so Wisconsin State Fair in Milwaukee is very unusual. As state parks are usually located in the capital, and so there was always a tug of war between the people up north and whatnot that they wanted to relocate State Fair to Madison, and in the '60s that became a real push, and some back deals and back rooms was made, and it ended up, of course, remaining in West Allis, Wisconsin. But several times there was actually what they call paper tracks, where tracks were considered, and land was actually speculated where the new track would be built. And one of them was up in Salem, Wisconsin. They were considering building a 1.5 mile track if the State Fair ever moved. However, it was not. There was even talk of expanding the Milwaukee Mile to a 1.5, and it was going to extend out into the north and widen it. Of course, one of the famous cars that used to race out at the Milwaukee Mile were the famous wing cars that Chrysler came out with in the late 1960s. Was the Dodge Daytona and the Plymouth Superbird. And those are also famous down in NASCAR, made famous with Richard Petty and Pete Hamilton. And however, those were banned, and only a couple ran after the 1970 season. But those cars ran more races at the Milwaukee Mile than any other track, running for three straight years. And there's a shot from 1971. And that's another shot. And you can see with the packed grandstands and that. What a lot of people consider the golden age of the Milwaukee Mile was in the early 70s. And there's another shot of the cars. The USAC series, United States Auto Club series, that ran the stock cars up here, was considered the NASCAR of the North. And other cars that raced at the Milwaukee Mile was the famous Suburban cars. 1968. Those were built by Lotus. And of course, the aforementioned movie Winning with Paul Newman, some people say it was Paul Newman that actually said it was actually Robert Wagner that said after everybody goes to Milwaukee after Indianapolis. 1993, we had Nigel Mania, and that was just an incredible situation for the IndyCar series at that time. Nigel Mansell was the reigning Formula One champion and had a dispute with Williams, the company or the team, the race team he drove for in Formula One. He didn't think he was getting paid well enough, and he quit the team and decided to go IndyCar racing. And signed a pretty lucrative deal with the Newman-Haas team, not as much as Formula One, pretty darn close. And with the sponsorship and with the media attention, a lot of instantly the media coverage in IndyCar doubled. And so you had media people from England, France, Germany, South America covering the IndyCar series like it was Formula One, and it was just really the profile of IndyCar racing was really raised. One of the most winningest drivers at the Milwaukee Mile in the 1970s was Butch Hartman. Butch Hartman also won 7 races in a row in the early 70s, and was quite a popular driver. As was Alan Kowicki, who won the 1983 Miller 200, his first win at the Milwaukee Mile. And with that, I was able to, along with Bob Mays, Richie Murray, and Pat Sullivan, we wrote a book. That's one of the books I wrote with them on United States Auto Club race history. Sadly, it was a series that pretty much went away in the early 80s and was largely forgotten. And raced at tracks such as Michigan, Milwaukee Mile, Pocono, and also a lot of dirt tracks. In doing the book, you always pick up stories, and I was able to expand on a few of them. One of them that was really became a labor of love for me was a lady called Miss Vanda Hurst. And I knew of her through my father. My father used to always say he went to a couple Christmas parties at her mansion in Fox Point, and she was a really neat. So I wanted to do a deep dive on her. And how it started was her husband started the company right in the middle of the Depression in the early 30s, and sometime in after World War II. So he passed suddenly of a heart attack. However, she was, they were pretty much partners. And she went to all of the trade shows and she did all the books. And so when he passed, all these companies came up and wanted to buy the company. And she said, "No, I'm not going to sell the company. I want to run the company. I know the business." And she did, and it became very successful and actually expanded. And she had a daughter, and she married, and the fellow she married was involved in auto racing. He said this would be a great way to promote the team. So they ended up initially sponsoring, and then ended up starting a race team with affiliation from Ford, and became a very successful race team, and was very popular with the fans in the early 60s. And so she was out in front with her son-in-law, who was Bill Trainer, who was friends with my father. And so it was just a neat story. And sadly, she's kind of forgotten. But you think of the TV show Mad Men and whatnot. She was in the boardroom, all those boardrooms and that, and she was going toe to toe with all the men. And she built a huge company, which I was later sold. And she was a very popular person, very fan friendly in that, and the drivers all liked her, and she treated everybody fairly. And that's Norm Nelson was one of the drivers. That's in 1960. And then the cars here, and there's some of the cars. Eddie Sachs was one of the drivers, and that's always a very confusing photo. So that's during the fair, and that was during Roy Rogers. Yeah. Was one of the grandstand performers, and those were his cactus that were up for a few days, and it confuses the hell out of people. They don't understand that. And the race team was located off of Howard Avenue, just west of Howell Avenue on Howard. No, not Howard, Oklahoma Avenue. The building's still there. That's Frank Brainy. He was a family friend, and Frank is one of these guys. He started racing midgets in the mid '30s, very early, right when the midgets started. Him and his brother, and but Frank was what they call a money driver. He didn't run for championships. He was out there to make a dollar, make a living doing it, and eventually ended up buying and running the Sleepy Hollow Hotel off of Blue Mound in Elm Grove, just on the west side of Elm Grove. And it became a very popular spot for drivers to stay at. And eventually, he is a kind of a vagabond, kind of neat guy. He ended up working for WTMJ, and he did the traffic reports in the 60s and early 70s in a helicopter, which crashed 3 times. But Frank was a neat fella, and lived to be 100 years old and 3/4. So, and of course, one of the race teams out of Milwaukee was Leader Card Racers with Bob Wilkie and his driver Roger Ward and famous builder A.J. Watson. They ended up winning the Indy 500 twice. The team was based in Indianapolis, but Leader Card was out of Milwaukee, and that's from 1962. Of course, drivers I raced at both the Milwaukee Mile and MotoAmerica, drivers like Mario Andretti. And of course, going back to the Miller 200, Al Hurt, and it wasn't unusual for them to bring in celebrities and whatnot, and doing a lot of cross promotion. And they would have cartoons like that. One more story here we'll do real quick. That grandfather clock is a great story. So Bobby Unser, one of the characters in auto racing, this is during State Fair. Drivers loved State Fair because they could race sometimes 3-4 times at the Milwaukee Mile, make some money. That's how they made their money back then, running races. And they would stay for the whole week. So they would look to the fair in between the races, and Bobby Unser's running around. He sees this guy selling all these grandfather clocks. He fell in love with them. And he thought, man, I'd love to have one of those. Of course, Bobby was kind of cheap and didn't want to buy one. So he talked the fella into offering it. He goes, what you really need is somebody broke the track record, you would offer a grandfather clock as a kind of a special gift. And so Bobby runs out, sure enough, breaks the track record and wins the grandfather clock. And so they're out on the front straightaway and up on the stage, and the guy kind of whispers in Bobby's ear and goes, "Hey, I've been kind of taken, haven't I?" He goes, "Come on, look at all these people. These are all potential customers right here." So there it is, posing with it. And I had the opportunity to visit Bobby a couple years ago, and there's the clock in his house. There's his brother Al, and there's a funny story with Al Unser. So they were both from Albuquerque, and they were wild. Race drivers back then were a lot wilder than they are now. And there's a joke that there's like a New York Times writer or somebody's out there writing a story on them, and they're driving wild, and Bobby comes up to a green light and he stops. He goes, and then he goes up and he blows through a red light, he blows through another red light, blows through another red light, and he stops it. He goes, "Aren't you worried about getting a ticket?" He goes, we kind of run Albuquerque, the cops don't mind, And so he goes, blows through a red light, he stops at a green light again. He goes, "Why are you stopping at all the green lights?" He goes, "Oh, Al might be coming by." And Super America, the race team was real popular in the late 70s with Dick Trickle, of course, one of the most iconic racers out of Wisconsin Rapids, and Tom Reffner, who unfortunately I don't think gets his due. He was from Rudolph, Wisconsin, one of the great and nicest guys, and a hell of a racer. And then Johnny Bogeman, which is always a great trivia question answer if you want to win a beer in a bar. Who was the third fella? Jerry Grant was a racer, and once again, there's a lot of shysters in auto racing. Jerry was not a shyster, but he was a victim of one, and that's Chris Vallow. Chris Vallow is a gentleman out of the northwest corner of Indiana, and was a businessman. And he's made a sponsorship with Dan Gurney and Jerry Grant, and they each got a check for $100,000. And it bounced. And Chris Vallow eventually ended up going to prison because he was bouncing checks all over the place. And I saw Jerry years later, and I asked him about Chris Vallow. He goes, "To this day, I still have that check in my desk, and with 2 NSF stamps on it." And then I found out that Dan Gurney also kept his check too. And you can see on the check there, it was an aircraft, Minnesota Farms, Greens, Insurance, Investments. It was all Ponzi schemes and whatnot. Yeah, Highland, Indiana he was from. And then he had another. He ended up dying. I believe he ended up dying in prison. That's Jim Hurtubise. And speaking of personalities in auto racing, that's Jim Hurtubise was one of the fan favorites. Drivers got burned real bad in a race, but made a comeback and was real popular. They did an article on, I think, the Look magazine on him and that. And that's Jim Groh, known as Crazy Jim. And Crazy Jim did a lot of did a lot of promotion and sold used cars and donated a lot of the trophies. So almost every victory lane at the Milwaukee Mile, there's Crazy Jim. And Crazy Jim ended up being shot in Las Vegas years later. And it was kind of funny because everybody when we talked about it, everybody was not surprised. He was a little bit of a huckster. And of course, what's the Southwest? Oh, I wanted to mention this, the Southeastern Museum that's based in Hartford. It's one of the great museums, which if you ever get a chance to visit, please do. That's myself with one of the inductees, Dave Watson. It's housed in the Wisconsin Auto Museum, and which is I think a lot of people are always surprised when they go in there and say, I never knew this was here, but it's definitely worth an afternoon to go visit. And as is downtown, of course, Elkhart Lake, Wisconsin, which really embraces the track and everything around it. So they bring in the race cars once a year in the downtown Elkhart Lake, and they'll get close to 50,000 people lining the streets as the cars come in, which is just a very, very neat event. And then also there's other events at the Milwaukee Mile too, not only the IndyCar racing, but we have the Harry Miller Club is a great event that we have in July, which promotes vintage IndyCar racing. And we've had the opportunity of having drivers like Johnny Rutherford come out. And it's with Dana Meekum. If you heard of Meekum Auctions, he's a big supporter and really has helped the club. So we'd love to see you out there. You can find us look us up on the internet. And to prove that it actually did work is one of the few shots of me actually working. That's me on the left-hand side talking to Dean Strom, giving him, he was doing PA that day. I'm giving him statistics on Scott Dixon, who won the race. And of course, Snap-on is a big supporter of racing at the Milwaukee Mile. Hope to see you Labor Day weekend. And also up in Elkhart Lake in July for the Dan Gurney reunion. That's what we had 4 years ago. It's an extraordinary event. It's an extraordinary weekend. We get 500 race cars up there. They'll be up there racing, and not only that, but also the Dan Gurney cars. And it'll be a really fun event. So if you're up there, please look for me outside the Seepkins. I'm usually at that table with all the other knuckleheads talking, telling lies, spinning yarns and whatnot. So appreciate you guys coming out, and hopefully I didn't bore you guys.
I learned a lot. Thank you, Steve.
Oh, very good.
Well, thank you.
Very good.